She never imagined you would actually leave. That's what makes it hit so hard. In her mind, you were always going to be there, no matter how distant she became, no matter how many times she tested your patience, pulled away emotionally, or treated your presence like something guaranteed. She thought your loyalty had no limit, until one day, your silence proved otherwise. Now, every unread conversation, every quiet night, every moment where your attention used to exist becomes a reminder of something she didn't fully appreciate while she had it. And what she feels now goes deeper than simple sadness. It's realization. The realization that losing a man who truly valued himself feels very different from losing a man who was only attached. Most men never understand this distinction. They believe holding on tighter will make a woman stay. They think chasing harder somehow proves love. So when a relationship begins slipping away, they panic, they over-explain, overgive, overfight. And without realizing it, they slowly destroy the very thing they're trying to save, because desperation lowers perceived value. But walking away with self-respect does the opposite. It changes the entire emotional dynamic. The moment you stop begging for someone to choose you, your energy becomes different, stronger, calmer, more difficult to manipulate emotionally, and women feel that shift immediately. See, walking away is not just physical distance, it's psychological. It communicates something powerful without saying a word. I know my worth, even if you failed to see it. That message lingers in her mind far longer than arguments or emotional speeches ever could. Because now, for the first time, she's forced to confront a reality she never expected. You might actually be gone, not temporarily upset, not waiting around silently hoping she changes, gone emotionally. An uncertainty like that creates emotional pressure most people aren't prepared for, especially when they assumed they had all the control. That's why walking away often affects her more deeply than constant chasing ever did. It disrupts the emotional pattern she became comfortable with. Before, she knew exactly how things worked. She could pull away, become inconsistent, create emotional distance, and eventually you would return, trying to reconnect everything. But when you stop reacting the way she expected, the pattern breaks, and broken patterns force reflection. Now she has time to think. Time to replay conversations. Time to notice the emotional stability you brought into her life while she was too distracted to fully appreciate it. Because distance creates clarity in ways closeness sometimes cannot. When someone is always there, people naturally begin overlooking their value. Human beings adapt quickly to consistency. What once felt special slowly starts feeling normal, expected, routine. But the moment that presence disappears, perspective changes almost instantly. Suddenly she notices the calmness you carried, the way you listened, the emotional security she felt around you, the consistency, the grounded energy. And the painful part is that most realizations arrive too late. That's why women often regret losing high-value men more intensely than they regret losing average relationships, because truly grounded men are rare. Most men today operate from emotional dependency. They need constant validation, constant reassurance, constant attention just to feel confident. Their identity revolves around being chosen. But a high-value man moves differently. He has purpose outside the relationship, standards, discipline. He values connection, but he doesn't abandon himself just to keep someone around. That kind of emotional stability leaves a lasting impact, whether a woman admits it or not. Because after losing you, comparison begins happening automatically. Every new man she meets gets measured against the emotional experience she had with you. And most people fail those comparisons quietly. Not because they're bad people, but because emotional presence is difficult to replace once someone truly experiences it. Confidence without arrogance, strength without emotional coldness, calmness under pressure. Those qualities become unforgettable over time, especially after she realizes how rare they actually are. And what makes the regret even deeper is that she often doesn't fully understand your value until your energy is no longer available to her. That's where distance changes everything psychologically, because absence creates scarcity. And scarcity increases emotional focus. The less accessible you become, the more space you occupy inside her mind. Now she starts wondering what you're doing, who has your attention, whether you've already moved on emotionally. And the more unanswered questions she has, the more emotionally invested she becomes in finding answers. That's the strange paradox most men never see coming. Sometimes your absence speaks louder than all the effort you gave while you were there, because once the noise disappears, she's finally left alone with the weight of what she lost. And that's when the emotional balance quietly begins shifting in ways she can no longer ignore. And this is where the dynamic quietly shifts in your favor. Because in most relationships, the person who becomes emotionally less predictable naturally gains influence over the emotional tone of the connection. Not through control, not through games, but through emotional discipline. When you step back, you're no longer reacting to every signal she sends. You're no longer seeking reassurance, chasing clarity, or trying to force consistency from someone who isn't offering it. And that alone changes how she perceives you. Because now, for the first time, she can't fully read you anymore. An unreadable energy creates a tension. She starts to feel that shift even if she doesn't understand it logically. That's why distance becomes such a powerful mirror. It reveals what was always there beneath the surface. If her feelings were genuine, she begins to notice your absence more deeply. Not instantly, but gradually, in small emotional gaps throughout her day. Moments where she expects a message and doesn't receive one. Situations where she instinctively wants your attention and it's no longer available. And that's when reflection begins. Not because you forced it, but because silence creates space for truth to surface. And in that space, appreciation often turns into regret. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind. The kind that builds slowly when someone realizes they may have taken your presence for granted. But here's what separates emotional growth from emotional manipulation. You're not creating distance to provoke a reaction. You're creating distance because you refuse to abandon yourself for inconsistent connection. That difference matters, because one comes from insecurity, the other comes from self-respect. And self-respect is what makes you truly stand out. Now, if we go deeper into what actually makes a man feel irreplaceable in someone's memory, it has very little to do with surface-level traits. It's not just appearance, not just status, not just success. It's emotional impact, the way you made her feel when she was with you. That's what stays. First, integrity plays a major role. A man who stays consistent with his values, even when it would be easier not to, leaves a psychological imprint that doesn't fade quickly. Because consistency is rare, and the mind naturally remembers stability more than unpredictability. Second, emotional intelligence. Most men react. Very few understand. A man who can stay grounded during emotional tension, who doesn't overreact but also doesn't disconnect completely, creates a sense of emotional safety that is difficult to replicate elsewhere. And once she experiences that kind of balance, it becomes a reference point in her mind, something new connections get measured against. Third, the value you bring isn't about doing everything for her. It's about how you elevate her presence in your life, the conversations, the direction, the emotional depth, the sense of growth she feels when she's connected to you. And once that influence is gone, she doesn't just lose a person. She loses a version of herself that only existed in that dynamic. That's where reflection becomes deeper. Because now it's not just about missing you, it's about missing who she was when she was with you, and that kind of loss is difficult to replace. Finally, there's legacy, the emotional imprint you leave behind. The conversations that stay in her memory longer than expected, the moments she replays without meaning to, the lessons she only recognizes after distance, has already created clarity. And even if she moves forward externally, internally something remains anchored. That's what makes regret so complex. It's not loud, it lingers. But while all of this is happening on her side, something equally important is happening on yours. Because the real purpose was never to trigger regret. It was to redirect your energy back to yourself. To stop measuring your worth through emotional reactions and start building it through action. That's where real transformation begins. When you stop seeking validation, you regain control of your focus. When you redirect that focus into growth, your entire identity starts shifting. Your discipline, your environment, your direction, everything becomes sharper. And from that place, you stop needing emotional confirmation from anyone to feel grounded. At the same time, your absence naturally creates contrast, not because you engineered it, but because presence and absence are felt differently by human psychology. When someone is always there, their influence becomes background noise, but when they step away, everything they represented suddenly becomes visible again. Their humor, their stability, their energy. Even the smallest details begin to surface in memory, and emotionally, that contrast is what reshapes perception. Because now she isn't reacting to your presence anymore. She's reacting to the space you left behind. But when you're no longer there, those suppressed emotions don't stay hidden for long. They rise quietly, in small moments she didn't expect. A memory triggered by something random. A conversation that suddenly reminds her of you. A silence that feels heavier than it should. And slowly she begins to replay everything in her mind. The good moments, the comfort you brought. The emotional connection she didn't fully recognize while it was happening. Because absence doesn't just remove a person, it reveals what that person actually meant. And in that space, realization deepens into something more intense. Not just missing you, but understanding what your presence added to her emotional world. That's where the dynamic shifts again. Because when you were always available, there was a quiet assumption that you would stay. That belief creates comfort, but it also creates imbalance. but distance disrupts that illusion. Suddenly, she's no longer certain of your position in her life, and uncertainty changes behavior in subtle but powerful ways. She starts reconsidering moments she once overlooked. She starts questioning her interpretation of you, and more importantly, she starts wondering if she underestimated what she had access to. That uncertainty doesn't push her away, it pulls her attention inward. And that's where emotional attachment begins to rewire itself, because now you're no longer just familiar, you're unpredictable again. And unpredictability creates mental presence. You stop being background energy in her life, and start becoming something she actively thinks about. That's what absence does at a psychological level. It builds contrast, and contrast changes perception. Now, another layer starts forming underneath this. Scarcity, not as a tactic, but as a natural result of distance. When something feels always available, the mind stops prioritizing it. But when access becomes uncertain, attention sharpens immediately. That's how human psychology works. We don't always value what we have. We value what feels at risk of being lost. So as your presence becomes less accessible, her mind begins assigning it more importance than before. Not because you changed, but because the dynamic did. She starts imagining scenarios, wondering about your life, your direction, your emotional state. And in those thoughts, your image becomes amplified, not smaller, bigger, more significant than it felt during constant contact. And that's where emotional urgency begins to form quietly in the background. Not loud, not dramatic, just persistent. Because scarcity doesn't just create desire, it creates awareness. And awareness changes how she sees the entire connection. But the most important shift is not happening on her side, it's happening on yours. Emotional detachment, not as distance from feeling, but as control over reaction. Because the moment you stop letting emotional impulses dictate your behavior, you regain something most people lose in relationships. Clarity. You no longer react to every shift in her energy. You no longer chase reassurance. You no longer attach your value to inconsistent attention. And that changes everything about how you carry yourself. Because detachment doesn't make you cold, it makes you centered. And centered energy is naturally attractive because it signals stability. She starts noticing that you're not emotionally reactive anymore, not easily pulled, not easily shaken, and that creates curiosity where certainty used to exist. At the same time, your focus shifts back to yourself, your goals, your discipline, your direction, and that internal shift is what truly increases your value over time. Because the more invested you become in your own growth, the less dependent you become on external validation, and that independence is felt even without words. Now time enters the equation, and time is where everything settles into clarity, because time removes emotional noise, it softens impulsive reactions, it replaces confusion with perspective. With distance, she no longer experiences just the moment of separation. She experiences the memory of the entire connection, and memories always reorganize themselves. The emotional weight of what was good starts rising. The emotional noise of conflict starts fading, and what remains is reflection, sometimes even idealization, but more importantly, understanding. Understanding what your presence actually represented in her life. And by the time clarity arrives on her side, something else has already shifted on yours. You're no longer in the same emotional position she remembers. You've moved forward, not out of anger, not out of strategy, but out of growth. And that's where the real lesson sits quietly underneath everything. Not in who regrets losing who, but in who learns to stay grounded regardless of who stays or leaves. Because at the end of it all, what remains is not the absence of someone else, but the presence you build within yourself when no one is watching.